Hello, everyone, and welcome to KT Connects, a monthly knowledge translation skills and best practices webinar series co-hosted by Arthritis Research Canada and Michael Smith Health Research BC. My name is Cody Primo, and I am a postdoctoral fellow working with Arthritis Research Canada and through the University of British Columbia, and I will be the host for today's webinar. A few things to note before we get started. Please use the Q&A dialog box to submit any questions for the speakers. These will be asked by myself during the last 15 minutes of today's webinar. The chat box is enabled and is intended for you to share your thoughts with fellow participants and the organizers. And to be safe, please do not share any personal information in the chat box. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on Health Research BC's website. If you use social media, please post content about today's workshop and anything about this series using the hashtag KTConnects. Now, before we begin, we want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who are the stewards of the territories from which we are located today. We recognize Health Research BC and Arthritis Research Canada are situated on the traditional, ancestral, and stolen territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, known colonially as Vancouver, Canada. From coast to coast to coast, we want to acknowledge all the Inuit, Métis, First Nations, and Indigenous people who have called Turtle Island home for many generations. Our aim with KT Connects is to serve as a catalyst for collaborative and collective learning, fostering meaningful discussions, engagement, and partnerships along the way. As we gather to have these conversations, let us also consider how we can actively contribute to the vital process of decolonization in our respective fields and daily lives. Please feel free to provide your own personal acknowledgements or commitments to reconciliation in the chat box. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing today's esteemed speakers, Dr. Alice Fleerackers and Dr. Juan Pablo Alperin, who are delivering the 6th webinar in our Open Science series. So Dr. Fleerackers is a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Journalism, Writing, and Media, the University of British Columbia, and a researcher at the Scholarly Communications Lab with Simon Fraser University. She studies the intersection of journalism, health, and science communication, and scholarly communication. She is also a freelance writer, the vice president of the Public Communication of Science and Technology Network, or PCST, and co-founder and co-chair of PCST's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Committee. Dr. Alperin is an associate professor in the publishing program, scientific director of the Public Knowledge Project, and the co-director of the Scholarly Communications Lab at Simon Fraser University. He is a multidisciplinary scholar who uses a combination of computational techniques and traditional qualitative methods. His work focuses on investigating ways of raising the scientific quality, global impact, and public use of scholarly work. And with that, I will pass it on to our speakers for today.
Great, thank you for that, Cody. Thank you everyone for being here, yeah, for taking interest in our work and these ideas and trying to learn a little bit more about preprint as a mechanism for knowledge translation and a little bit talking a little bit about open science as well. So we're going to sort of split this up between Alice and I. I'm going to sort of get us started to get the conversation going and setting some of the foundations, and then Alice will take it over with some of the more specific and more I would probably say the more hands-on-y parts and things that are giving you the more concrete bits that you might be able to actually take away and work with. So we can just get started maybe a little bit, just move on to the first slide, Alice, if you can help me with the driving here. So maybe just get started. You know, we put preprints in the title. We're talking about preprints and open science. So I want to start off with a little bit of a couple of definitions of what preprints are and what is it that we're talking about when we talk about preprints. I've taken sort of 3 different definitions that are kind of similar to one another, or at least the first 2 are. The first one is from ASAP Bio, is a group that promotes preprints and is trying to advocate for preprints in the biomedical sciences. And they sort of define in their Q&A preprints as a scientific manuscript that has been uploaded by the authors to a public server. So here, key thing to take away here is that preprints are, they define it as something that is a scientific manuscript, something that's a sort of a research paper or an article, something that is in some sense intended to be a publication that's been uploaded and made public. A different definition, just taken from Wikipedia here, is a preprint is a version of a research paper or a scholarly article that is shared publicly before it has been formally peer-reviewed or published in an academic journal. So again, here, both of these sort of sources define preprints as being very much something that takes the form of a traditional research paper or a scholarly article and shared publicly in some form. And then I provided my definition of how I think of a preprint, because I don't like the idea of this notion of constraining preprints to only being things that look very much like a research article or that need to be intended to be published in a journal article. And so I defined a preprint as something that was uploaded to a preprint server. And here is intentionally to open up this notion that a preprint can actually can take different forms. They can be essentially some parts of research outputs or results. They can take other forms other than articles, such as anything that's trying to communicate some research knowledge or some findings or some parts of the process of research, and someone trying to make that research or that part of the research or the process publicly available and has chosen to do so in a way that is so that it's intended to be seen as a scholarly output of some kind. And so I try to take a more more encompassing definition, but you'll get the sense that essentially it's research or parts of research that have been shared with the public. Let me just move on to the next slide. I'll say that preprints, and then I know that this series, and you've had a few different sort of talks related to the concept of open science, but I'd like to think of preprints as really just being one small part of a larger movement towards open science. The diagram that you see there is taken from the UNESCO recommendation on open science that was agreed upon by all of UNESCO member nations some years back. It was kind of developed during the pandemic. And they really talk about 4 different pillars of what open science is about. They talk about open science being about opening scientific knowledge. This is very much squarely where preprints fit in, but also around sharing other also published peer-reviewed research papers, but also sharing research data, sharing other kinds of scientific outputs. And it's really about the opening up of the outputs of science. But they also talk about 3 other pillars that are actually often not thought about in other definitions of open science and in more narrow and in what I would say an old school view of open science, if we can have that, in a concept that has not been around that long formally as a concept. And these other 3 pillars are the open infrastructures around saying that the technologies and the tools that are used to make that science available to the public also need to be based on openness and needs to be in some way owned by the academic community. And then 2 others that are going to be quite important for us in the conversation that we're having today is dialogue with other knowledge systems and other ways of knowing. And here, the UNESCO recommendation explicitly calls out indigenous knowledges as part of that. But I also think about it as in terms of knowledges from other parts of the world and that are appearing and working from different epistemologies. And finally, and again, very critical to the conversation today, is that they also talk about open science as being about open engagement with other societal actors. And it's about involving people that are not traditionally part of academic systems to also participate in the creation of knowledge and to work together and opening up of the processes of science so that it also includes these other actors. Let's move to the next slide, Alice. To give you, and then there I will spare you reading the full definition, but I just wanted to put it on the screen of how the UNESCO recommendation defines open science. That is really, and I'll touch upon a couple of the elements of this definition. Again, it's not the only definition of open science, but it's the one that I think at our lab and in our work and with Alice, we've been really operating from, because it's one that is really about talking not just about opening up the outputs of science, which is that open knowledge pillar, but also this notion that it's about, and I've just highlight that last bit at the end of the definition, to open the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. And for me, this is what's exciting about open science, and it's the part of open science that I think makes it as a concept, as an idea, really worthwhile, which is really about academics need to operate from a mode that is not about we are doing what we do and we are giving it to the public, but rather how can we find ways of bringing the public into helping to form the research questions and participating in the processes of and the decisions about how we decide how we're going to go about trying to answer them, and really involving them, everyone from broader segments of society into what we do. For me, again, this is not the only way of defining open science, and it's definitely not one that has been the most common one. But the UNESCO recommendations have put this broader definition of open science really on the table and at the foreground of international discussions. And I think it's the one that we try to operate within. If we can just hit the move forward. Here are where the elements of science communication, and here around, it's not just about taking the outputs that are open, but here the concepts of science communication and knowledge translation fit in as mechanisms that can be used to try to bring in that engagement. And again, not just to give knowledge to the public, but rather as the opportunity to have them engage in the research processes itself. So we can go on to the next slide, Alice. I want to turn it back to preprint. So again, that was sort of like this broader thing. We have these other pillars, we have these broader concepts. And so I wanted to first ask everyone in the audience here if you have ever read a preprint. So what we're going to do, since I think you all have the chat enabled, so I want you to just type your answer, but don't hit enter yet. We're going to get everyone to hit enter at the same time and do a sort of a cascade of answers. So I want you to think, have you ever actually read a preprint? And so you can type in the answers, whether you do it all the time, whether you think you have, whether you have no idea if you have. So take a moment to write your answer if you have ever come across a preprint that you have tried to read, and give as much extra detail as you want. I'll give you just a few seconds to do that. And then when I say go, you're going to hit enter, and we're going to get all 32 of you that are in the attendees crowd, and even the other panelists that are here. You can type your answers as well, and we'll get a flood of answers. So okay, so everyone go ahead and hit answer now. And we can, okay, I'm just gonna, hold on, there we go, okay, so we've got some yeses, some nos, some maybes, right? People that are providing some detail around, if they can't find anything else that's published. Those that think that they have. Someone that hasn't read but has submitted a preprint, so that's also great to see. Okay, so just to get a sense a little bit of where you're all at. If we can just hit the next, Alice. I mean, and I won't get everyone to answer this question right now. We're going to get to it in a second. But the other thing that you might have not thought about is that if you read a preprint, you would know in some sense. If you've gone to a preprint server, perhaps you would notice that it's labeled as a preprint server, and that's where you downloaded it and you notice. Or maybe it's labeled at the top saying that this is an unreviewed research article, and that it hasn't undergone peer review. So there's other ways that you might be able to know that. But the other question is, have you ever read a news story that mentioned a preprint? And this is something that, and if you just hit next one more time, Alice. The other question, and that one I want to get to, is if you had read a news story that mentioned a preprint, how would you know? And again, Alice is going to go into a little bit more detail on this thing, but if we can just go to the next slide, Alice, I do want to ask you one more question. This is an example taken from a story from BBC News. And so you can see the title there. I've obviously not included the whole story, but I've included one paragraph there that has 2 links. And both of those links are to research. And so what I want to know is if you're looking at that, and I'll get you all to take a guess. The same thing, just type your answers into the chat, but don't hit enter yet so that you don't influence everyone else here. Do you think that the first link is a preprint, or the second link is a preprint? So the hint is one of them is a link to a paper published in the journal Science. The other one is a link to research published in the preprint server, medRxiv or bioRxiv. I can't remember, one of the two. I'm just forgetting which one right now. So do you think that the first one is the preprint, or do you think that the second one is the preprint? So take a second to read that paragraph, type your answer, but don't hit enter yet. And okay, go ahead and hit enter now. So we've got, we're pretty split down the middle. I love that Alice also included that, even though she's done probably more research about preprints in the news more than anybody else in the world, still has no idea. And we're pretty split down the middle. Although maybe, and I'm not going to go ahead and try to do a full accounting here, and just in the interest of time, but just to satisfy your curiosity, it's true. And I think that Andrea, your last question, your last comment there, is exactly kind of a little bit the point that I'm trying to make, is that without actually clicking through, or at least looking at the URL, and by just looking at the ways in which both of these pieces of research are mentioned and cited in the story, there's no way of knowing. And really, that's was probably why we're split pretty much down the middle, because everyone is just kind of taking what is essentially a random guess. There's really not very much there to give us detail as to what it can look like. And Alice will go into a little bit more detail there. But I just wanted to say, preprints are mentioned in the news. We don't always know. And you have probably come across them before. And so even though this is a topic that you're coming across for the first time in today's webinar, perhaps in terms of explicitly thinking about it, in fact, in your reading of regular news stories, as researchers mention on a fairly regular basis, you have probably come across some news stories, especially around with topics with the pandemic, that mention preprints, and you might have not even known it. So I'll finish there. I'll pass it on, hand it off to Alice, who will go into a little bit more detail into some of these different elements, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Juan. Really nice segue into what I'll be diving into, which is a bit more information about how and why journalists are using preprints and what that means for you in your work as knowledge translators. So in research that I've done very much with Juan, as well as other members of the ScholComm Lab, we've looked at various ways in which journalists are using these things, especially in COVID, but also more broadly. And we found that journalists are turning to preprints as a source for their reporting for a pretty wide range of reasons. And find them from diverse sources. One of those sources is researchers, probably like many of you here on this webinar. Journalists are very reliant on researchers for many parts of their work, and they find research through them when they interview them, and a researcher might tell them, hey, I have a new preprint out, or you should read this other study by my colleague, which would be very informative for the article you're writing. But they also find them through social media. Back when Twitter was Twitter, that was a really key source for journalists. And many have told us in interviews that they sort of monitor what scientists are talking about. And this alerts them to what are the key pieces of research coming out now that are most relevant, most exciting. Interestingly, during COVID, at least, journalists said that they were finding out about preprints via press releases. Now, I've put the little asterisks there because traditionally many press release servers like Eureka Alert have actually had strict rules that you can't share a preprint, in large part because it fears that it's not yet peer reviewed, and it's possible that the findings could change by the time it's published. So we don't want journalists reporting on this research. But during COVID, it seems like they changed that rule, at least temporarily. And we've seen in our research that many preprints were actually being shared by these servers. And then for some journalists, they're actually actively searching through preprint servers. They're going on there, digging in, searching for preprints in the areas that they report on to find new story ideas. And that sort of segues into this question of why they're going through the effort to find preprints when there's all of this publicly available or all of this peer-reviewed research that is available to them. And the first one is that actually some of that research is not free to use. It's not open. And although many, especially sort of journalists at traditional media outlets, at things like the New York Times, they will have access to many research publications through their organization or through a professional association they might be part of. But many folks, especially freelancers who are not part of those associations, don't always have access to published research. So preprints are always free to access, and journalists say that this is one reason they use them. They're also exciting because they can allow journalists to get an exclusive scoop. So journalists are constantly competing to have stories that other journalists don't have. They want to have a story that's exclusive. And While traditional journal articles are often heavily promoted through press releases, lots of journalists are getting alerted that this kind of research is coming out. Far fewer journalists are monitoring what's happening on preprint servers. And so journalists have told us that that's exciting because they can get a story idea that someone else is very unlikely to be covering. Journalists also like preprints because they're timely. They're coming out kind of as soon as the research is done, whereas, as you may know, peer review can take weeks, or in our case, as social scientists, often months. And so the preprint allows journalists to see science in motion. That kind of speaks to that part of the UNESCO recommendation of not just opening up the finished outputs, but also science as it's evolving, the process of research. And journalists found this very exciting. News, after all, is by definition supposed to be new. And connected to this last point, because preprint research is coming out kind of as the research is wrapping up rather than months later, it's often more relevant to the key societal challenges of the day than peer-reviewed research. And this was very important to journalists, especially during COVID. So during the pandemic, we saw a huge surge in how much journalists were reporting on preprint studies, and they became a really driving source of, in many cases, very important research-based articles that were alerting people to key questions that were on our mind, things like how long COVID could survive on surfaces, sort of common questions about immunity to this virus, debunking problematic research, but I should also say, in some cases, spreading problematic research. But even beyond COVID, we've seen examples where preprints are highly relevant to things that our society is grappling with on a daily basis. Things like the development of AI tools. This was based on a preprint, and developments like this, new Alzheimer's tests that could potentially help us diagnose this more accurately. However, despite this benefit of bringing in timely, relevant research, journalists do have some fears. And the first is these aren't formally vetted through peer review, and so there's always that potential for misinformation to spread through their coverage of preprints. They tell us there's no extra safety net like they expect peer review to act as. And related to this, they have no idea how to replace that extra safety net. So journalists again and again told us that they really struggle with how to verify this unvetted research in the absence of peer review. First of all, it's time consuming. Second of all, it requires expertise in the science, and not just science, period, but specifically the science that that preprint is talking about, which most journalists don't have. These sort of potential benefits and these potential risks are very much in the mind of health and science journalists, or people who frequently report on research, when they're deciding whether and when to cover a preprint. They described it as a careful risk-benefit calculation. A question of, do we think that the audience needs to hear the story now, or can they wait 6 to 8 weeks for the story to be peer-reviewed? I laugh at this quote every time because I myself have never had a study published in 6 to 8 weeks from submission, but this might be more common in other fields. So essentially, journalists are asking themselves, what could go wrong if this research doesn't end up holding up? And I've reported on it and shared that widely. But also, what opportunities does the public or my audience or society miss out on if we don't share this research now? So this sort of becomes the guiding questions that journalists are asking when they decide to cover preprints. Ideally, most journalists try to vet this research before they're going to be using it in their stories, like the one that Juan shared earlier. But the ways that they try to do this to kind of decide whether this is trustworthy science vary widely. So some journalists told us they use gut instinct, which is actually kind of a traditional way that journalists vet information in general, which is slightly alarming. There's a big reliance on sources and reputation. So the reputation of the researchers or the institutions they come from. Now, this is more specific to research on science journalism in general, but I have seen some examples in the interviews we've done of journalists mentioning this. They try to triangulate, so looking at the findings of the preprint and comparing it to findings of sources that they kind of trust already to see, do these align with what we know from other places? Journalists said they just try to read preprints very critically, as they say they do with other research, but with an even more skeptical lens. And then I love this one. Journalists told us they do their own peer review. And this peer review is essentially a very rapid version of what scientists and other researchers do. The journalists will try to find experts who can contextualize and evaluate the research and give them a sense of, is this trustworthy? Is this significant? What are the strengths and weaknesses to be aware of? Top science journalists, or the recommendation would be to get a few more experts to comment on a preprint than they would a peer-reviewed paper. Does this happen in practice? I have no idea. This was a recommendation from Sarah Everts, who's a very established science journalist, award-winning. I don't know how much this happens with other journalists, but the idea is this is actually not completely different from what journalists do with normal research. They're supposed to get some comment from outside sources. I think the difference here is that they're really treating that comment in this case as a peer review, as a check, as that safety net. The most difficult thing here is to find an actual topical expert. So rather than just some person who studies immunology, finding somebody who studies the specific type of immunology that's in the preprint. And we saw that during COVID, journalists are not always so good at finding the right expert to comment on research. And essentially, they're trying to get a consensus on the science. Is this like in line with what most scientists think is happening? Are there uncertainties or controversies worth noting? And how big and important are those uncertainties? And how large is the body of conflicting evidence? Again, some of these findings are from our own research, but some of these points are also recommendations from Sarah Everts. The most important thing, if you're a researcher and a journalist is interviewing you and asking you these kinds of questions, is they might not actually let you know it's a peer review. They might just be saying, hey, I'd like to interview you about this new study, or I'd love your comments. So it's almost your job to treat it like a peer review, even if the journalist isn't describing it that way. And then once they've decided, I'm covering this, I vetted it, I feel confident in the findings, journalists are going to use that preprint research in their stories. And as Juan's point has already sort of hinted at, that isn't always done very explicitly. So it's very common to see things like a study found or research found. The kinds of hyperlinks like the ones in Juan's story are also very common. So journalists just providing a link to the preprint and not mentioning even that it's a study. But sometimes they do mention that it is specifically a preprint. They might say this is not yet peer reviewed. It's sort of preliminary, early, uncertain research. It still needs to be verified. And in some cases, journalists will actually say a new preprint. Now, whether people know what that means is another question. I'll briefly dig into that. But these are sort of some of the ways that journalists are trying to communicate that this is not a classic research study. Oops. And in research I've done with Juan, we found it was about 3 in 5 stories that communicated one of these various ways of indicating it's a preprint. Now, really recent research I've been doing has found that these strategies are not always very effective in terms of alerting folks to the fact that the research being communicated isn't actually a classic research study. So summing up, long story short, our research has found that people who read stories with these kind of indicators don't understand that this means it's a preprint. About 10 to 30% of folks, depending on the study and the sample, understand preprints as unpeer-reviewed, publicly available, and or not published in a journal. So in the ways that Juan said, these are often defined. An additional or much larger group of people understand that these are also sort of, or more preliminary. Oops, there's a knot there that shouldn't be there, but they sort of have a sense that this is a little bit more early or initial than a peer-reviewed journal article. But among people who don't understand them in one of these sort of accurate ways, people understand them in this really wild way, or wild array of other ways. Some people in studies we've done define them as plagiarized content, unproofread news stories, reprints or copies of things, trailers for a movie, or trustworthy and credible and confirmed science. So a huge diversity of what people think a preprint is when they see that mentioned in the news. And the really important point there is including a mention that the research is a preprint doesn't help people understand it much better in most cases. So in general, when we're talking about how journalists communicate science, peer-reviewed or not, it's also important to note that it's very uncommon for a journalist to specify that research is uncertain or that there are important caveats or that this is preliminary, regardless of whether it's peer-reviewed. Uncertainty tends to not be mentioned unless it sort of adds something exciting to the story, like, ooh, there's a controversy brewing around these findings. They are top science journalists who are really embedded in this work, and they're working for an outlet that allows it. For example, in a story I wrote really recently, my editor was actually encouraging me to do more work of communicating the context of the research as well as its limitations. This is that point about researchers being really important for journalists' work. Some journalists will be more likely to communicate uncertainty if the scientists they interviewed said, it's really important to mention these caveats. So again, this is where you could come in if you're ever speaking with a journalist. And instead, journalists tend to focus on the implications of the research for the public, for society, so contributing to that UNESCO goal. The exciting, new, unexpected, timely, or socially relevant dimensions of the research. And again, in general, they're just so dependent on how researchers describe their studies, their own and their peers. And that's true of how they speak with them during interviews, but also how the scholarly communication frames research in press releases. A very quick note, not all journalists are the same. Specialists, so people who cover research all the time, are much more likely to do sort of that rigorous vetting we've talked about to be able to communicate uncertainty effectively than generalist folks who might be just reporting on this as part of some other study or be asked by their editor to quickly report on it. And specialists versus generalist media outlets might behave differently. Like you'd expect to see more preprints covered in outlets that have a specialized science section, for example. Different media outlets give you lots more space or lots less space to talk about research and have different editorial practices. So just a note that these are findings that we've found in our studies, but there's a lot of diversity within journalism. So people may be using different practices at different times. Okay, we threw a lot of information at you just now. And so I want to briefly pull it all together in terms of what this means for researchers and communicators or knowledge translators. First, preprints come with really exciting benefits, but also important risks. They can help mobilize research faster, make it freely available, contribute to that open science goal of bringing the society into science. But there's a question about misinformation and findings not holding up in peer review. So it's a good idea to ask yourself whether it's worth it to share a preprint now, is it worth it to post this if it's a highly controversial subject, but also is it worth it to promote this through my networks in public spaces? Because preprints are publicly available, they are accessible to a journalist. And as I've mentioned, journalists are actively looking for these. So it might be worth preparing some kind of public-facing summary that puts this research into perspective and really clarifies the key points. So a lay abstract, a blog post, a social media post, or a press release, if that's allowed, where you can really clarify the realistic public implications. You know, not that this is breakthrough science, but what can this actually contribute to society? Explain those limitations that a journalist might not be aware of, or not be able to understand, and really make that accessible. Take care in how you share this research. If you want people to know it's a preprint, saying this is a preprint, it probably isn't enough. And again, stressing that what are the actual limitations or things to be wary of is potentially, and we need more research about this, but potentially a more useful strategy. This is maybe the most important point, but if a journalist does reach out to you and they want comments on a preprint, whether that's your own or somebody else's, respond, make time, even if you think it's too early to do so. This is so crucial. They're going to report on it anyway, and you have an opportunity here to help ensure that they do that responsibly. So respond quickly, communicate everything I've laid out in number 2, the societal implications and the caveats. And if possible, you could suggest some peers or colleagues who could also help critically review the work. So to sum this all up, how well journalists communicate about preprint research is really a shared responsibility. Obviously, journalists need to be doing this work. They need to be critical, reflective, asking themselves those important questions about how and when to share research and doing that verification. But it's also up to us as researchers and communicators to support them in doing that. Whether it's by putting out knowledge translation products that help them understand preprint research and the benefits and risks it might bring, but also being responsive, answering their questions, pointing them to resources that could help them do their job better. And perhaps most importantly, and interesting because we've just talked about how different preprints are from other research, this is actually true of all research. Journalists need our support to make sure that they're communicating research in ways that are going to be helpful to society, rather than potentially leading to misinformation. All research can be flawed. All research can be retracted, share findings that are actually hurtful to society. And so many of these lessons we've talked about today are really good to keep in mind in all of your knowledge translation work and all of your interactions with journalists specifically. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. We'd love to spend some time answering your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. And everyone join me in thanking our 2 speakers for today. So we'll give everyone some time to be able to put their questions in the Q&A function. I see some of them are already starting to come in. I saw that actually Dr. Alperin has already addressed one of them, but maybe if we can go through it for the full group out loud. So the question was, how does preprinting an article impact subsequent peer review publication? So if you can maybe just summarize what you've already written in the chat as well for everyone.
Yeah, sure. It's just the advantage of 2 speakers now while Alice was talking. I was just sort of going through it, but I did hold off on answering that second one just so that we could talk about it as well. But yeah, the question around what does it mean for the pathways if you submit something as a preprint? What does it mean for it to be published in a journal? So I'll say that so the 2 sort of pieces of information that I think are relevant here. And the answer is, one is that most journals allow this. They either explicitly allow it, and there's an increasing number of journals that have a policy that say that they don't consider preprints to be a previous publication, the way that they wouldn't, like they want to publish original research, but they consider a preprint to still be unpublished in some sense, even though it's been, by the definition, has been made public and it's available. And so either they have an explicit policy allowing it, or it's just generally implicitly assumed by most. So for the majority of journals, it's still something that's good to check. And there's some places that you can do that. The Sherpa Romeo is a resource that you can use to check. But then we also see that a good number and a majority of preprints do end up published in peer-reviewed journals. And there's different studies that try to look at those pathways. But we do see that most things, as for those 2 first definitions, are things that are in preprint servers are intended to go to a journal. And so then we do see that most things do end up being published in peer-reviewed journals eventually. I think, as Alice pointed out, the 6 to 8 weeks it's a little bit optimistic as a timeline in terms of how long peer reviews actually take. I've seen 6 to 8 months, I think, is more reasonably in many cases to suggest. But anyway, that's that there is, it's understood that preprints are not a publication and that things can eventually make it to be peer reviewed.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I've seen it go even longer than 12
Yeah.
months. So it can definitely take long. And with that, just to give everyone a little bit of a sense. So I know some people at the beginning, when you asked the question, had said, they've read preprints before, but some hadn't. So maybe giving people a sense of typically the format of what that looks like. Like, is it basically a research article in its full form, or are there different formats or mediums that can be presented for preprints?
Yeah, I would say that most preprints look like what the research article looked like when someone finished authoring it in Word, right? So they essentially print to PDF, and that's essentially what they upload to preprint servers. So this is why you might have read a preprint and not known it. If you might have just thought that sometimes a preprint looks very similar to what an archived version of an article might look like. It's essentially the author's version of the article, and it could be that it's gone peer review and you've incorporated your edits, or it could be that you haven't submitted it to a journal and it hasn't gone peer review. So what the actual document looks like doesn't change very much. It is good practice to label preprints in the header of the document to indicate. And some preprint servers, when you upload them, will either add a front page or they'll add a stamp to the header to indicate that this is a preprint and where it's available online. But if you just had someone sent you a PDF and it looked like an author's manuscript of a research article, there would be nothing there unless it's been explicitly said that it's a preprint. It would look the same if it had been peer reviewed than if it hadn't.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also looking at some of the other questions that have come in here. So this one here has actually a few questions in there. So I'll read through the whole thing and maybe we can go through each of the questions. So I understand that from this presentation, journalists look at the preprints. However, when I submitted my study to preprints, I received over 20 invitations from different journals to submit my article. So there are benefits to disseminating preprints, but then how to discern if the journal invitations are predatory. I decided to use preprints because I needed something for audiences to have during my PPT on the study. Can you discuss how preprints also make impacts to other areas beyond journalists? So maybe just that first piece, so that connection of the preprint going out and then getting messages from journals. How to go about that process.
You want to take that first, Alice?
I mean, I too get a million invitations from potentially predatory journals about as soon as I post a preprint. And one thing that is interesting there is I've usually already submitted it to a journal, first of all. So I'm not sure how often is this strategy actually useful. But a while back, I was about to delete one of those emails without reading it. And it was a real legitimate journal run by people who I really actually admire and very relevant. And it was kind of a great opportunity. I mean, I told them, this is actually under review somewhere else. But now that's a journal I'm keeping in mind for future research. And if this study that doesn't make it through peer review at the other journal, which it has been sitting in for a while, I'll keep that place in mind. It was actually a very open science minded journal. So I guess have a quick look, read the emails. One point to flag is, this is a huge discussion we probably shouldn't get into here, but this notion of is it predatory or is it not is very challenging, and folks are increasingly talking about predatory practices than predatory journals, because some of the big name, established and esteemed journals arguably do some predatory practices, like charging extreme amounts of money to publish. And so it might be more useful to start looking at, do I like the way that this journal is operating, rather than is this on some list somewhere on the internet? So that's just my 2 cents. But yeah, that's a whole other barrel of fish that we can't dive into today.
Mm-hmm.
To answer a little bit the second part, if you like, and preprints, you know, the main place where preprints circulate is amongst researchers. So this is I would say that, you know, we've been talking about and we've been studying and trying to document this role that preprints are playing, and also making research accessible and being used by journalists as a way of bringing in the public into and getting access to it. But the main place where preprints are circulating are amongst academic communities, and so this is I would say that, you know, the impacts that preprints are having are around the rapid dissemination of research results within communities that already have some connection to one another. And we've seen this in some disciplines. The practice has been ongoing forever: physics, computer science, and math. Like, this has been a standard practice. In economics as well, has been standard practice to share working papers, which are essentially preprints, and as a main mechanism. So that's probably the biggest place where preprints are having an impact. But then, you know, as soon as we make any research, whether it be preprints or open access available, then it has the potential to go beyond, and it can be taken up by others and used in ways that we might have not anticipated. And I think that's one of the beauties and the advantages of open science and of open access, is that it tries to open up those doors.
Yeah, definitely giving access to multiple different avenues. There's a question. Well, actually, before the next question, we had someone thank you for the excellent presentation, so that's great as well. The next question was, where do we go specifically for preprints, like to access them, or to submit preprint?
Yeah, so it depends on the discipline that there's a few different preprint servers. There's a lot of preprint servers that have cropped up, and somewhere on my computer here, I've got a slide with the like 50 or something different preprint servers that are out there. So there isn't any one place. I would say for this community, probably the place where you'll be looking at most likely is bioRxiv and medRxiv in terms of health-related preprints. But there is also, there is a whole slew of different preprint servers that are out there, and I can maybe, as we answer other questions, see if I can dig up a link to some of those resources. But bioRxiv and medRxiv are probably the two most likely ones to have health-related content.
And I'll add briefly on the sign up page for this webinar, we shared a link to ASAP Bio, which they on their website actually have a database of all the preprint servers that's searchable. And so you can look at what are the subject areas that these preprints focus on, what are their policies. Like, some preprints have different kinds of checks that they ask you to do, like you have to specify whether you have openly available data, etc. So that's a really useful resource, especially when you're, well, for both reading and submitting, to get a sense of, you know, what are the servers in my discipline that might be worth looking at. There's also preprint servers that are more like area specific. So maybe you want to do research about Japan, like what's happening in Japanese context. There's a Japanese focused preprint server. So yeah, just flagging ASAP Bio is a really good resource for that.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we can, when we re-upload the recording from today, we can include that under there as well. The next question was, how can we ensure that well-written, accurate preprints become the quote-unquote norm for journal article submissions, and what needs to be done in academic and journalistic circles to help promote this practice?
Let's see. Here I'll take a bit of maybe, I don't know about controversial, but like an opposing stance a little bit, that I think that one of the things that for me is the beauty of preprints is that they can, and I think, and I don't know about should, but that we should be welcoming things that are not well-polished, finalized versions that are essentially the same thing that gets submitted to a journal article. I think that from the researcher's perspective, if we wait until we have the article in that ready form, we're still delaying the sharing of results. And we're, in some sense, not inviting as much feedback and input from the academic community or from anywhere around what it is that we're working on. Once it's finalized, you're really not intending to make changes anymore. And if we want to invite others to be able to into the conversation, sharing things that are more works in progress is a way of still receiving that feedback and input at a time when you might still have a chance to do something about it in terms of how you frame it, how you discuss it, what interpretations you make with the results. And so it's maybe not quite answering the question, but a bit pushing back on that premise that it might not necessarily be the most desirable outcome for preprints. And I think we need to be careful to not make preprints too much like the same thing that's going to end up in the peer-reviewed article. It's not just about the timing of when it's shared. It's also about how open are you still for feedback and for changes.
Yeah, I'll add to that. One of the papers that a lot of the research I discussed today was drawn on. I mean, it was very polished when we submitted it. It was ready to submit to a journal, and it is worth stressing that many people use preprints that way. So it's not like they're just posting stuff at random out into the world. They stand by what they've done, even if it is still at an earlier stage. You know, as scholars, our reputation is very connected to what we put out into the world. But that research paper, the PLOS one that was shared in there, we posted it to a preprint server. And then I remember I tweeted about it back when Twitter was Twitter. And a bunch of people commented on my tweet, one of whom was a scholar whose theoretical framework or concept we'd used, and he let me know, actually, we've updated this in the COVID era because it's kind of shifted the way we should think about this concept, and here's a link to that paper. And the other one was from a journalist at Nature who said, oh, you know, have you thought about the fact that people at trades journals or specialist publications might be using these differently? And both of those points at that time, I flagged in our manuscript that was currently under review at the journal as something that I wanted to integrate during the peer review process. And we did. So that speaks to Juan's point also of, you know, posting a preprint at a time when there is still that potential to really benefit from this feedback potential that preprint servers offer. That doesn't mean you should be posting things you don't stand by, but there is an element of preprints are science in motion, as one journalist has put it, and trying to make them too much like a journal article loses that potential and that benefit.
Yeah, some great points on how it can really help even elevate the final product of what that work does become. I'm moving on to the next question here. So great talk, many thanks. I'm reflecting on what authors are trying to achieve through preprints. Can you reflect on the different motivations behind preprints and implications of this variation for how we view preprints? So I know you did talk about wanting to get the information out there earlier. We did talk a little bit about potential for feedback and things like that, but what are some of the other advantages that you see with engaging in preprint?
I can start if you like. Yeah, so one thing that comes up for researchers is this putting out your stamp, like, you know, signaling we've done this research so that you're first, which is interesting because that's how journalists are thinking about it, that scoop out, not getting scooped fear. There is some research suggesting that when you preprint an article, it gets more citations and more attention in other forms of digital media like social media and the news media than if you just were publishing it as a peer-reviewed article. Some people post preprints just because they believe in open science and they want to have a publicly accessible version, but also as Juan is suggesting, you know, that sharing the process and yeah, opening the black box of science. Some people use preprints for things they never intended to publish at all. And that's really important because some forms of scholarship aren't really welcome at journals. Things like negative findings where you didn't find what you were looking for. And there's, you know, we all know about publication bias and how over time because we're only ever getting our significant findings published. If you were to do a meta-analysis or a review of the field, you get a really skewed perspective on how effective a particular medication is. And so some people use preprint servers as a way to share that kind of research. Yeah, those are some of the main reasons that come to mind for me. I don't know if, Juan, you have others to point to.
I think you touched on the important ones. The main one we find is because people just want to get the research out there more quickly. And so that is the by far in all surveys that I've seen kind of touch on, that's the biggest motivation for folks. But I think the other pieces that Alice, the other elements that Alice pointed out to are also there to a certain extent. I can say personally, I've sometimes publish preprints on things that I know, like I feel confident that the research is good. It's a field, it's something that we're working on where it's like very rapidly moving. And I cannot be bothered to go through the slow process of the peer review with the journal. I've done a peer review myself where I send it out to colleagues that I value and respect, and I get them to give me feedback. And then I incorporate that feedback, and now I don't have to deal with the whims of reviewer two or of an editor, and I just have it out as a preprint. And I think for me, it's like I feel confident in the community. I know that the people are going to value that work, and I don't feel that there is going to be much value in getting the peer reviewed. The peer review would just be for me to have a publication on my CV that says peer reviewed. And if it's not that much of a driver for me at this stage in my career. So sometimes I just leave things as a preprint, and I can just leave it there if I think it's going to reach the right audience.
To that point, this was really interesting during COVID. We saw some behavior of researchers that was more leaning towards that, and I think motivated by the societal relevance of research. So on medRxiv during that time, so the health preprint server, like COVID preprints were getting published much less than other preprints. They were sort of shorter, rougher, really sharing research in that more preliminary state because we needed that research immediately to be able to start building, diagnostic tools and treatments and things. Society needed it immediately. And so researchers started posting them with that motivation, which is really interesting from that UNESCO open science definition perspective.
Yeah, definitely. We do have just a few minutes, so maybe one more question. We have about a minute or so to touch on the key things that you see. But what are some of the ethical implications of applying preprint research to clinical settings? This is less of a journalism question and more focused on applying promising interventions from preprints.
I can take that, but because only because I'm going to echo what Alice was sort of saying at the end. The same way that all of the stuff that we've been talking about, the same norms and practices that we're saying, journalists should consider when doing research, also actually apply to research that has undergone peer review. Peer reviewed is flawed in so many different ways. Both as a process, who participates, the kinds of things that make it through peer review that are not caught, the gatekeeping and biases that are present in both because of the people that participate, but also because of the practices and norms around what is the sort of publication biases that are inherent. There's so many things wrong with peer review that we know about, that have been studied, and that yet we continue to consider it to be some kind of a standard or measure of quality. It provides no guarantees. And I am not a clinician, nor do I have any medical expertise, but I would hope that any medical provider or practitioner that is involved in the care of others is not relying on, well, this has gone through peer review, therefore it must be good, but rather to be triangulating their findings with other research and other studies, with their own knowledge and training that they've received, and is using that to make decisions. Something that as a preprint is no more or less certain to be correct and be valid for clinical practice. I think that it is, if it's gone through peer review, that two people have agreed that it's up for publication. And so if two people are verifying something is enough for you, then, and if for whatever the case is, then sure, you can take that as a marker, but it's not enough on its own. And for preprints, it's exactly the same thing. You could just share it with two colleagues that know about the topic and say, what do you think of this? And you would be getting the same kind of validation that you do with peer-reviewed work.
Yeah, some really contextual, important points, I think, to bring it all in. So thank you both so much for a wonderful presentation and discussion today. So just to close things off, this brings us to the end of today's webinar. And please join us on Friday, December 6th at 12 p.m. for the next KT Connects with Dr. Shannon Freeman, Associate Professor in the School of Nursing at the University of Northern British Columbia, for a conversation about engaged research and open science. Please stay tuned for communications from Health Research BC in the coming days for more information about this webinar, including registration details. A reminder that a recording of this webinar will be available online from Health Research BC in the coming weeks at healthresearchbc.ca/KT-webinars. Here you will find 7 years worth of KT Connects content focused on knowledge translation skills and best practices. This includes the past 5 webinars that have all been focused on the themes of open science as well. We encourage you to watch and share this content with your networks using hashtag KT Connects. Thank you to everyone in the audience for your time and interest today. We hope that you found this talk as enlightening as we have. Your feedback is very important to us and will help improve future KT Connects webinars. A link to a brief survey will launch immediately after the webinar ends and will also be sent to you by email. Please take 2 minutes to share your thoughts about this webinar and this open science series. Thank you very much in advance. And with that, we hope to see you next time. Until then, take care and have a great day.